Okay, amazing. We're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. We're so happy to have you here. My name is Asher Goodman, and I'm an organizer with Sierra Club BC. I'll be hosting and moderating the webinar tonight. I am hosting the webinar where I live on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I've been here since about 2015. And I'm really trying to think about what obligations I have as an uninvited guest and settler on these lands and how I can show up better. So some housekeeping for today. If you're having any technical issues at all, just send a message in the chat to Aurora, who's our behind the scenes tech wizard, and she'll be able to help you out. Tonight's session is being recorded and you will get access to the recording. Everyone who registered will get an email with the recording. So if you have to run out for some reason, you'll get that email and you can finish watching later. And then Zoom also has closed captioning, which you can turn on. If you need help figuring that out, again, just message Aurora and she can walk you through those steps. Awesome. So we're really excited. We have a huge turnout tonight. We have over 900 people registered, which is so great. We're really excited that you all are wanting to learn more about old growth. So tonight we're going to talk about how incredible old growth is in terms of biodiversity, a livable climate, Indigenous stewardship, tourism, recreation, and so much more. We're going to talk about what makes these ecosystems so special, provide an update on provincial old growth policies, and discuss the importance of supporting Indigenous protected and conserved areas, or IPCAs, and other Indigenous-led solutions for old growth in BC. Our incredible panel includes SciMSO, Ross Reed, and Jens Wieding. Each panelist is going to present for about 20 minutes, and then we'll jump into Q&A. So as you're going through, if any questions come to you, just put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to do our best to answer them. Awesome, so let's get started. Up first tonight is Ross Reed. Ross is an environmental educator and outdoor filmmaker who grew up in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. He's better known by his successful social media account, Nerdy About Nature, which he launched in 2019 as a joke between friends who were tired of him constantly talking about all the trees around us. I think a lot of us can relate to that. The project really took off during the pandemic and has since evolved into a way to provide fun, accessible education about the world around us and to inspire and engage folks with the outdoors. He has an impressive 287,000 followers on Instagram, so he's the famous one here. Awesome. Ross, take it away.
I think you're muted, Ross.
You got unmute. No problem.
Sorry about that. Not sure what I'm doing here. Is this working now? Am I on? Can I get some thumbs up from people? Okay.
Looks good.
What's up, everybody? My name is Ross. Thank you for the lovely introduction. It is a privilege and an honor to be joining everybody here on this call and with my fellow panelists here, Sai and Jens, very amazing people. So my name is Ross Reed. I was born in the Cascadian bioregion, which is kind of this area here that I have highlighted. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term bioregion, it's just an area of land that's kind of encompassed within watersheds and coastlines that all share similar climatic and ecological features. So this whole area here is known as the Cascadian bioregion. And I was born in Washington State on traditional Puyallup Nation territory, and I currently reside out on in Yakutat Nation territory out on Vancouver Island, and I'm joining you from this call today from Squamish Nation territory. So I am just all over the map right now. So it's a really beautiful part of the world, and I'm here to share with you all today about basically why old growth is so awesome. If you know anything about my account, about the things that I do on the internet, I am a bit of a fanatic for old growth. And I think it's really amazing for many different reasons. The thing that really brings it home for me is just the fact that this is just these old growth forests exist in this slim moment of time as they are now, that they've never been in the past, that they never will be in the future. And that to me is kind of this really beautiful, almost Buddhist sense of like being in the present moment with these ecosystems that have evolved over millions and millions and billions of years. So before we jump into how they are now, I thought it would be a good idea to set the stage with where they began. So for those of you who are familiar with evolution. 1 second, I'm just going to set my timer on my phone so I don't make this run overboard because I can do that. So life began on our planet about 4.5 billion years ago in shallow seas, and it lived there for quite a while. And then about 470 million years ago, it slowly started to migrate out of those shallow seas and onto lands, nearby lands, tidal areas. And back then, it was just a very thin layer of algae, this photosynthesizing algae that was able to gather energy from the sun, convert it to sugars, and then use that to grow. And eventually, they formed non-vascular plants, which we can see here. This little bit of moss I have here on the it's my right or my left side. So these non-vascular plants are kind of the first type of photosynthesizing plant that lived on the planet about 470 million years ago. Then about 500 or about 450 million years ago, so after 20 million years of existing in this non-vascular state, life was able to evolve into vascular plants, which is a whole different type of vascular tissue that allowed them to grow into great big giant structures through the development of lignin as a structural element. And we have our very first, what we know as a tree, Archaeopteris here, which is the one on the right. That's kind of the first tree. And life continued to evolve like this for millions of years. So as different species and niches became available, different species would evolve in those niches. And then we have the Carboniferous period about 300 million years ago, which is the first really big explosion of plant life on the planet. And this was such a dramatic event that it drew up tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, stored it as carbon in the woody cell walls of all these plants. And it changed the climate from one that was then very hot and warm and humid into one that was very cool and habitable for species like us to evolve. And I think this is a good thing to start with just because it encompasses the scale of forests and the way that our kind of atmospheric conditions, our global kind of climate conditions rely on these forests and interplay. Like forests literally have the ability to change the world. And the world kept on changing. So back to where we are here in the Cascadian bioregion. About 120,000 years ago, we enter our most recent ice age. So there was about a mile thick of glaciers everywhere on that northern half of that map I shared down to about the what is now the Columbia River down southern Oregon or southern Washington. About a mile thick or more of glacial ice covering this whole area, and it began to recede about 20,000 years ago, leaving barren landscapes. And about 10,000 years ago, there was no more of that glacier left, and we've kind of entered this period of time that we're in now. And as those glaciers receded, we had early successional species like lichen that came and broke things down. They broke down mineral surfaces, formed the first soil here. Then we had what we call first generational successors, different species within the like different species of alders and willows that would have moved into those mineral soils and then used that. Then as these deciduous trees dropped their leaves, that formed an organic matter soil, which was rich in nitrogen, which allowed for conifer trees to move into these ecosystems as they've developed over the past 10,000 years since that glacial retreat. And then as these forests developed, we have all sorts of things that follow as a result of these forests. These barren, rocky landscapes get turned into lush forests that change the way that the rivers flow, that bring bugs and insects about with them. And then as those rivers change, salmon start making their way up and they start feeding on the bugs. They start bringing nutrients from the marine ecosystems up to these forests, which help these forests grow. And then with that, you get bears that move in to eat these salmon that help distribute that. And then along with that, you get another critter, another animal on this planet we all might be familiar with, humans, which also follow the fish, which use these forests as home, which established homes using all these materials and resources, all the stuff that these forests have evolved to kind of provide us with that we more or less take for granted these days and don't really think about. So these forests that we exist in today, these forests in Cascadia are our way of life. They have evolved into very complex, interconnected ecosystems, and these ecosystems both depend on different regimes and create different regimes that allow every species here to thrive. So they rely on the hydrology of the area, the different rain patterns we see, but they also create rain patterns. They create microclimates. They rely on the terrain, the steep kind of rocky terrain that erodes really quickly and or relatively quickly over a long period of time, but they also require that and build that terrain that determines kind of the niches as you move vertically along the area here. And then, obviously the temperatures, we're in a temperate temperate coastal watershed or temperate coastal rainforest here. So these cool temperatures and long growing seasons helps everything flourish. And then the disturbance regimes, whether that be fire, wind throw, drought, all of this is kind of interconnected into the complexity of these forests. And within this forest, you have diversity of old trees, young trees, snags, all these different species working together. And there's a lot of various interconnections. So we have different disturbance events, whether that's windfall, landslides, floods, different aspects of forest succession, or fire in that case too. And we have many species, like I mentioned before. The alders are typically our first generational successors to these areas of disturbance, where they fix nitrogen in the soils using symbiotic relationships with bacteria in the soils, which creates a lot of nitrogen in the soil, which allows for conifer species who can't have that, who can't create that nitrogen, to come in and succeed. So there's this balance of all these different microbes and different species working together here. There's different fungi. There's like saprotrophic fungi, which help break things down, dead and decaying things, to recycle those nutrients. There's parasitic fungi. There's mutualistic fungi, which we're all probably familiar with, the wood wide web, or these mycorrhizal fungi networks that connect everything in these forest ecosystems. So this example here, we have western red cedar on the right-hand side of your screen. We've got big leaf maples in the middle, and then some sword fern here down at the very bottom. And all of these species here are connected through an arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi network that helps distribute nutrients between these three different species, not only seasonally when when the big leaf maples aren't photosynthesizing in the summertime. The cedar and sword fern will help support that, and then in the summertime, when those maples are photosynthesizing a bunch, that excess energy will be distributed to everything else. So there's these broad interconnections created between different species, different fungi, different kind of webs of life. So we've got the flora, the fungi, and the fauna all working together here. We've also got more mutualistic fungi, which I just love this photo of this little Lobaria genus of lichen here, which is able to synthesize nitrogen from the atmosphere and drop that through to the forest floor to help replenish the nitrogen in those soils when it's at kind of a climax forest state, and relying less on those disturbances with the alders coming in. Again, just filling niches here and providing the ability to help everything flourish. And then, of course, when we have mature forests, we have this interconnection between rivers and these forests and the marine ecosystem. So mature forests provide shelter from predation in the rivers. They shade and cool waters, then woody debris, these giant old growth logs that fall into everything. They end up slowing the water flow and creating pools and eddies and all sorts of different things that maintain higher water levels during drought seasons. They keep things more resistant to floods, the kind of complex structures along the bank, and they stabilize gravel and alluvial materials, which provides perfect habitat for salmon to spawn in. And these salmon, they will, come from the oceans as adults, and they will make their way up these rivers, bringing with them loads of nitrogen 15 and carbon 14, these heavier isotopes that are found in marine ecosystems. And then when bears and wolves and eagles and scavengers prey on these salmon, they drag those nutrients deep off into the woods, where they're decomposed by other species here. And that nitrogen helps find its way into the soils so that everything here can continue to thrive and grow. So, there are cases where we found nutrients that are like nutrients derived from salmon far above waterfalls. That's all connected and brought there by the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil and the scavenging bears that will take these carcasses hundreds of meters out into the forest away from the river in a place where salmon can't reach. So again, this interconnection between these marine and terrestrial ecosystems that we have here. And I know I'm rifling through this. I'm just conscious of the time, and I really don't want to go over because it's disrespectful.
You're doing great. You can totally slow down. You got time.
Well, I'm not even halfway through my slides, and I'm halfway through my time. Um, so forest complexity is kind of this thing that develops after thousands and thousands of years. And the BC government typically classifies these forests as old growth at 250 years or 140 years in the interior. But I really want to drive home the fact that these ecosystems are so much older than that. Some of the oldest western red cedars that we have in the area can be over 2,000 years old, and they provide all sorts of features and functions for other things to live and grow. So as these trees age, they form these complexities, through different types of vegetative reiteration or regeneration, where the crown will reiterate and generate new leaders, forming candelabra tops, these rich canopies and the cedars and spruces. And these types of structures only begin to form in red cedar trees once they're about 350 years old, and then they only develop as those trees continue to age. So again, over 100 years older than what we classify old growth forest as, from a government perspective. And then within these crowns, you get these really dense complexities forming epiphytical mats. So an epiphyte is a plant that lives on another plant. In other words, you've got all these non-vascular plants, these mosses. You've got the mutualistic fungi, lichen. You got ferns growing up in the canopy, and all this works to kind of collect bits of soil and detritus that allows other things to grow up there. You know, huckleberries, hemlocks will be growing up in the canopy of these other big trees. And certain species will live in these tiny little niches way up in the canopy. You know, you got different amphibians like Pacific tree frogs and salamanders. There's complex nesting habitat that forms for birds like marble murrelets, which are an endangered seabird that only exist in the complexities of these old growth forests. And then as we continue, you know, looking at the complexity here, we get these what's known as a multi-layer canopy. So you have those bigger, older matriarch trees, and then you've got one like a space where a tree fell over, and then you've got younger trees kind of filling in the understory and the kind of creating this multi-layer canopy as these gaps are created and things start to grow on them and grow within that. So you get life on life on life kind of growing here, and it helps to create a really amazing microclimate. So this multi-layer canopy it maintains a lot of moisture, so it's really damp and cool in the summertime, but it also keeps things nice and warm in the winter because the winter winds don't whip things away, don't whip warmth away as easily because of all that complexity in the forest. And within that, you get this diversity of different plants filling all these different niches here with everything playing a different role. So we've got, you know, Douglas squirrels, red huckleberry, those holes on that cedar there, those are all made from a pileated woodpecker, kind of very quintessential rectangular hole. And then obviously we've got, what is that? Sorry, moving my screen. It's a red-headed sapsucker we've got there. So all these different species that live in these forest ecosystems that help distribute seeds, they help distribute nutrients, and the forest itself kind of creates home and habitat for these different ecosystems or for these different species to survive here. Everything from, you know, the little birds and chickadees that are kind of bouncing between the branches to martins, bears, birds, all sorts of insects, just really rich, complex biodiversity here. And then you get complexity developing within the trees themselves. So you get like a nurse log that will fall over and provide home to a new tree that's growing on top of it. Like we can see this little spruce growing on top within that epiphytical mass of all those mosses and ferns growing on this fallen log. And that gives them an opportunity to grow above the forest floor, above the competition there, so they can grow big and strong. And then as they do that, those roots will cover that nurse log, creating a really cool, looking thing like this as that nurse log kind of degrades, and eventually it'll end up leaving these standing cavities like we have here, leaving an elevated root structure. And this is a really important habitat feature for larger megafauna we have here, things like bears, martins, and even ungulates like deer and elk. There's a lot of studies that show that elk, present in mature old growth forests, which we don't typically think elk is being present there, but they'll actually will stash their young kind of in these bigger gaps in these trees and use this as protection for their young. And again, these are things that happen over thousands of years. This complexity is so rich. So, you know, you have a 1,500-year-old cedar, let's say, that has this root structure suggesting that it grew on a fallen 1,500-year-old tree. Suddenly that complexity is more than just the 1,500-year-old age of those trees. It's a 3,000-year-old complexity that's taken that much time to form. And that's not anything that we can just quickly recreate in a 70-year kind of harvest cycle like we're currently operating on. And it's certainly much older than, again, the definition of a 250-year old growth forest. And all the stuff that I'm speaking about very rapidly, thank you for hanging on with me. These are all just the things that we can readily see. You know, like our perspective as humans is always going to be limited by the fact that we will never know what it's like to perceive things as a tree, as a martin, as a bear, as a salmon, as a fungi or a moss. Like we will always be kind of perceiving it from our worldview. And thus the things we study are the things that we can most easily interact with. So these big trees, you know, but we don't know nearly anything about these kind of super tiny, teeny tiny nutrient cycling processes, all these different things that exist kind of below our frame of reference, you know, like the super micro scale and even the macro scale. Our brains aren't equipped to handle those structures. So like we we can't think of it or comprehend the way that these forest ecosystems interplay with different climatic functions on a global scale. And then this is all just going into say, as humans, like we rely on these ecosystems for so many things, most of which is totally unspoken or totally unappreciated by us, all sorts of things that we would call ecological function. So this rampant diversity and spacing between these trees, this multi-layer canopy here, makes them much more resistant to wildfires. The fire that would come through naturally here would just burn through plots in the understory and leave the bigger, more mature trees standing. The diversity of roots and understory here reduces erosion along creek sides and lakes, and as water runs down during heavy rain events, all that complexity on the forest floor is going to hold that soil together and reduce not only the erosion but sedimentation of our creeks and streams, which smothers salmon habitat, as well as landslides in mountainous regions. Those roots are going to hold that soil together and keep it clinging onto those steep cliffs and slopes that we are blessed with in this region. And then again, that multi-layer canopy, it prevents microclimatic fluctuations. So if you can imagine you have a big gap in the canopy, that's going to be a lot hotter and drier in the summertime than if there was that multi-layer canopy with shade and different layers kind of holding things in. And then all these different things photosynthesizing, it all works to clean the air. It's acting like a big filter. It cleans and stores our water. It slows the rate of through flow down through these ecosystems. It creates biodiversity. And most importantly, in an era of changing climate, it sequesters and stores very, very, very large amounts of carbon, most of which actually exist in the soil. So we think about carbon storage in forests, and we kind of talk about it happening in the trees, but 70% of the carbon held in these temperate forest ecosystems is actually stored in the soils by those mycorrhizal fungi. And when we cut those forests down and kill those trees, yeah, we lose the carbon stored in the trees immediately, but that whole mycorrhizal fungal web dies, that trophic web underneath the soil, and we get the slow release of that carbon held in the soil that can be leaching through an ecosystem for 20 years, sometimes longer, depending on the growing season and where these forests are. So that all goes to say, we rely heavily on these forests for their ecological function, all this stuff, part of what makes old growth so dang amazing. But when we clear cut it, as we can see here, we lose all of that. We lose all the complexity, all the ecological integrity, all of that biodiversity. And, we're left with images like this. So this is me standing on a tree that was over 450 years old, so which is over 3 times the age of Canada, as you can say. Over 200 years old is what we define as old growth. And, typical forest management works on 50 to 70-year timescales, and these ecosystems literally take thousands of years to mature, develop, and create complexity and store carbon in a meaningful way. So they're not something that we can easily replace. And unfortunately, these clear-cut tactics are still being rampantly used all over the province, all over the world, and they are ecologically inappropriate in literally every single forest ecosystem type. There is no way to justify clear-cut logging, and science has proven that time and time again, yet it's the most economically viable way of doing things. So that's kind of where we're stuck with on like a forest management perspective. And yeah, that's why I think old growth is so cool and why we should protect it.
Wow. Thank
That
you.
that's my spiel.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ross. I think you somehow managed to condense my entire forestry degree into 20 minutes, so that was incredible. A note to everyone, you can keep sending questions in the Q&A to Ross. We will answer questions after all of the panelists have gone. So we haven't forgotten you. We're just going to return. But yeah, thank you so much, Ross. That was amazing.
Mhm.
Next up, we have Saya. Saya is a member of Tla'aque'ex First Nation in Clayoquot Sound and has worked for the past 20 years for his nation, growing and establishing its tribal park program and laying the groundwork for one of the first Indigenous protected and conserved areas, or IPCA, in Canada. He's a husband and a father of 3. His family keeps him passionate about the future. Residing in Opitsit, he currently works to establish long-term relationships with the tourism industry in Tofino, with the goal of all visitors to the area becoming aware of tribal parks and how to respectfully visit them. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me here today, and well done, Ross. Always inspiring to know the contributions and values of old growth. Very, very aware of the value of old growth for Tlaoquit people. Our culture cannot survive on second growth. We can't make totem poles and dugout canoes and longhouse logs and with second growth. There's just too much knots in it. And the water in Tofino comes from Mears Island, and it's not by damming up big valleys and storing water. It's from the old growth forest that is drinking the mist from the sky and trickling it into the river, into the creek, and constantly flowing water over to Tofino. So it's providing value to economies and our culture. Tlaoquit has had a long relationship in establishing conservancies. From 1984, the Mears Island Aboriginal Title Court case was fought to prevent deforestation from McMillan Bloedel, and our elders declared Mears Island a tribal park as a way of describing how to share Aboriginal title, because we were coming out of court and an injunction was put on logging so that we would negotiate what is Aboriginal title. And tribal parks was declared on Mears Island, but it sat stagnant for 20 years while we negotiated at the treaty table the existence of our Aboriginal title. And it just didn't happen at the treaty table. They were making efforts to extinguish our rights and title. And it was wrong for us to sign a treaty that would extinguish our right to say no to provincial designations, or to put their laws as higher, or our laws secondary to provincial laws, because we had just won a court case to say no to logging, which was a provincial designation. So after about 20 years or so, in 2006 and on, our lands department was instructed to assert our rights outside of treaty while other leaders in the nation continued to negotiate, till we finally voted our second treaty down in 2011, and tribal parks continued onward. We began our second tribal park in 2008 for Kennedy Lake, the two largest freshwater lakes on Vancouver Island, traditionally known as Ha'ukman for Tlaoquit. And our third tribal park was in 2013. We took another set of watersheds as a management unit and described what our vision would be for these watersheds. In our tribal parks, we took the first declaration in 1984 and enhanced it and made it into a 2-page declaration. And it is an assertion of our rights. After each tribal park designation, we would propagate our maps on our website and start dialoguing as if this is our vision. It isn't what the provincial designation is. In 2008, we declared Claygate River Valley an intact old growth forest. We declared it as a no-go zone, yet it stayed as a tree farm for, 20 years. It only got removed as a tree farm last year. Even Mears Island, as a declaration, it took 40 years for us to designate a conservancy on Mears Island. It doesn't mimic a tribal park. It's not an Indigenous designation, a conservancy, but it was a designation that infringes us less than a provincial park does. And it doesn't fully implement our Aboriginal rights in our homelands, but it was a designation that we chose to utilize. We do envision that we wish for a different designation, an Indigenous protected area designation of some sort that would fully and more appropriately implement our rights and title. Yet the protection of old growth was so important for our leaders, so we did adopt that designation last year with British Columbia. They had a 2-year old growth set aside. No logging of these certain 13 watersheds of old growth. And in that period, at the end of those 2-year hiatus, we had done enough work, fundraised enough to be able to buy out a tree farm. And that's what I see a little bit of confusion about what IPCAs are, that we declare what we want to do in our homeland to protect, but an IPCA won't become reality until there's a willing seller of a tree farm and the nation miraculously has money to buy it. And then if the nation is willing to buy it from the tree farm and they're willing to sell it, the province in Canada is willing to come along and make a designation that will protect it, thereby making a legal IPCA. Without a legal designation from BC, it is an assertion model where your nation is describing its interest, and we felt that it was important to describe our entire territory, and to describe a vision or a plan that would develop the best opportunities for our grandchildren and the survival of our culture, our fisheries, our drinking water, our spiritual bathing practices. And it couldn't be done piecemeal. It had to be our entire territory, and to look at our territories without the hindrance of any provincial designations, to create a vision for where we want to go, and then work from there, and hopefully retain that vision for where we want to go for as long as it takes to implement it. And for us, for Mears Island, it took 40 years, and other areas that were designated took since 2008 and onward before they became a reality. Tourism plays an important role with IPCAs or protected areas. Anytime there's someone that goes on our boardwalk trail on Mears Island and they experience having a forest bathe, the spirituality, the uplifting that comes from being in a forest that's intact as such, those are the people that go back and advocate and understand. And so it plays an important role. I also am aware, Tlaoquit suffers from tourism. Tourism has a role. It needs to be lifting. Rising tides should float all boats. And when we're doing this protection and setting aside of forests, tourism needs to be helping the nations who are doing those designations to properly benefit. And it's often told for First Nations, well, you're doing really good with economic development. You have a hotel, or you run some businesses in town, but municipalities don't build hospitals, schools, and longhouses and infrastructure in their communities by running businesses. We need to be benefiting from the economies, the taxes, and the systems that are designated in our territories. So tourism, most other industries have some type of royalty that are paid to First Nations, but tourism seems to be getting somewhat of a free ride. And we're not trying to collect money from the business. We're trying to ask the client that is willing to come here and see and experience the beauty of the land, to leave something behind. And while the business is here, if after 7 years the business leaves and goes back to Toronto, for the time that they were here, something was left behind for their grandchildren. And that's much like our land vision. We're looking at how best to hand a vision for our future that will take care of them. And in our land vision that Tlaoquit created, we looked at all the second growth that was in our territory, and we designated that as our future working forest. And it was all the flat land harvesting in the Kennedy Flats, all the steep land logging, no more, too much rock slides and difficulties and cost of logging. And it was also a lot of the mountain areas was our old growth that remained. So we kind of end up with a circular protected areas. We had a federal park and other old growth protected in the mountains. There's still some untouched land called BCTS, BC Timber Supply Area. We're at negotiations that we want the province to donate that to our tribal park so we can make that a conservancy. The difficulty currently, and just lastly, on our land vision, with the Kennedy Flats. And so our members were asking, as we went through iterations and consulting with our members on what type of vision, what type of land we'll be handing our grandchildren. They said, well, if we're protecting this old growth, why aren't we protecting all of it? And so thus our old growth areas that we wanted to protect, it started to grow and grow and grow across our map. And then we have a vision for our second growth to be our woodlot to be transferred from a tree farm to a First Nation woodlot that our nation will manage. And it's all roadside flatland harvesting. The highest value. There's not going to be much cost to logging that. It's all roadside flatland. So our grandchildren's future, we still want the ability to have machines to move logs and to diversify our economy, but we're trying to walk this line between not having impacts. Our tribal park is active in restoring rivers that British Columbia long ago walked away from. They destroyed some rivers, and we're at the cost of having to put millions of dollars into install log jams to create space for salmon to hide under, to slow the river down and to stop the movement of gravel. And we're having to install these because of what BC walked away from so long ago, and it's on our backs to fundraise for that. So we're keenly aware of the impacts of logging in our nation, and the flatland logging is something that will bear much less impacts to our future. And so it became a very pointed interest of our nation to see our salmon streams recover. Tlaloquit people have not consumed a salmon out of our river in my whole career at home. We've never, as a lands manager, never opened our river for a fishery because we're still recovering from the devastation. Every salmon that returns inside these islands needs to go up the river to spawn. Our fishermen go offshore to catch the Fraser River salmon. So that's quite poignant to think that we're not eating fish out of our own rivers here. And then yet, even adding to what Ross was sharing earlier, there was a study in Clakewood Sound that had shown that the DNA makeup of our old growth trees, 33% of the DNA in the tree was salmon. And so it just speaks to how integral the salmon is to establishing the old growth forests and the nitrogen that comes from those decaying bodies to feed these trees that don't have a bunch of alder dropping nitrogen on the ground. It's salmon that is bringing that to the forest. So we need to get back to our system of abundance, and it's incredibly complex, from salmon that feed on herring, from a mismanaged herring run that is supposed to feed Chinook, that feed whales. The Nuu-chah-nulth system of laws took care of herring because we know we could get we're a whaling society, and our greatness does not come from naming monuments and mountains of ourselves. Greatness in Nuu-chah-nulth culture comes from potlatching and giving away and feeding our people. And when one whale could feed your people, you establish systems of laws in your territory that ensures that whales are in abundance, that salmon are in abundance. And that led to really vibrant old growth forests as well. I just want to make sure I've hit on some of the talking points from tourism and the importance of these conservancies, and I guess just like some of the hurdles of Indigenous-led conservation. It is incredibly hard. It takes a lot of patience because your designation and what your vision is. It took a lot of buy-in. When we went to oppose a mineral claim in our third tribal park, by this time the mayors and the Chamber of Commerce are supporting our tribal park declaration. They're supporting our vision, and the Chamber of Commerce president and the mayor came with Tlaloquit down to Victoria to meet with the Minister of Mines to say, who wants a tailings pond in this watershed? We just did a tribal park open house, and nowhere was this in our plan. So creating buy-in, creating alliances with leaders, and it can take a long time. So just to not give up and to speak it will make it reality. To speak your visions will apply effort to it. No matter how long it takes, you'll get there. Shoot, let go.
Thank you so much, Saya. Thank you to the work that you've done and that your nation has done for a long time. And I'm just thinking about the way that we can all work together so that your children and grandchildren can eat the fish out of their rivers. Yeah, so keep putting Q&A questions in the Q&A box. We'll answer them after. Next up, we have Jens. Jens is Sierra Club BC's Senior Policy and Science Advisor. He has over 20 years of international experience protecting forests and supporting climate action. He's guided by the realization that we cannot stabilize the climate without intact forests, and that we cannot save intact forests without a stable climate. So over to you, Jens.
Thanks so much, Asher, and thanks, Ross, and thanks, Saya. It's truly a privilege to do this together with you. And thank you so much to everyone joining tonight. Thank you for never giving up despite all the challenges and the new challenges that we are faced with. It's really not an easy time to be in, but there are also a lot of opportunities, and we are truly blessed that we live in this part of the world. Thanks for the introduction. My pronouns are he, him. I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And listening to my fellow panelists, I want to take a moment to share just how inspiring I feel every time I get to spend some time in an old growth forest. And one thing that really stands out for me is the three-dimensional space, the fact that there is so much in terms of habitat, of life, of carbon, of cultural value, and it's everywhere. It's beneath your feet, it's above our heads, and everywhere surrounding us. And I think that's really important to recognize, because a lot of our governments, Western society, looks at forest in a two-dimensional way, and essentially claiming that it's still a forest after clear cutting because very small trees are growing back, but clearly it's not the same, as Ross and Saya pointed out. So we have to keep raising these arguments to make progress, and I'm going to use a few slides to look at our opportunities to keep going. Now I have trouble getting into the corner. 1 sec. Okay, this is better. Oh, that was too fast. So we will take a moment to allow for a quick recap of the most important commitments that we have seen in recent years here in BC. And you have heard about all of them, and I appreciate that you are still here to keep asking for progress. There is progress. There are some steps in the right direction, and I will go over some of the recent changes that we have seen. But as you know, we have really significant commitments in form of the Old Growth Strategic Review with the 14 recommendations. In 2022, when David Eby became premier, we saw a commitment to go ahead and create Indigenous protected and conserved areas, IPCAs. And then in 23, we saw a really big milestone when the BC government, the federal government, and BC First Nations Leadership Council announced the nature agreement tied to $1 billion funds, previous funding commitments and new funding commitments to enable progress towards increasing protection to 30% by 2030. And very importantly, the biodiversity and ecosystem health framework, which was shared in draft form also late 23 and combined with consultation led to thousands of people submitting supportive comments. And we are now eagerly awaiting for a final framework. So these are really important commitments, and we are a bit concerned because, as many of you know, when we looked at the mandate letters after the election, this is what you will find if you search for BC government mandate letters, an overview page. If you scroll through, you will see all the letters that went to ministers in January, and there was a bit of a difference in compared to previous mandate letters in that there was a lack of details, of commitments looking at these things. So we are hearing from many that don't be too concerned. This will continue. Work will continue on these commitments. But it was a bit of a warning sign, and this, as you know, got more serious with the trade conflict. Now, all governments are talking, speaking about the provincial and federal governments, talking a lot about fast-tracking projects, industrial development, and there are good reasons why Canadians are concerned and why there's a lot of focus on the economy right now. But the key concern here is that we cannot afford to address one crisis and do this in a way where we ignore the biodiversity and climate crisis. We all know that that will not lead to positive outcomes. We have seen this over a long time, that undermining the natural life support systems that we all depend on will impact the economy and jobs as well. And we are already crossing red lines. We have to keep working to motivate government to continue with these commitments and not put them on the back burner. I'm going to mention briefly a few resources that you can find if you want to go deeper, if you want to prepare for meetings, for example, if you have a chance to raise your concerns with your MLA, if you want to join with others to do this. Back in September, we shared a little bit of an update on what's happening with forests. I'm not going to go into details, but this and many other background pieces you can find on our website if you go to our media releases. There was one media release on September 20th, and just going to show you some of the key trends that you can find in this overview. Don't pay attention to all the text, only to the words in bold. So we have a little bit of an update on old growth logging rates, clear cutting overall, forests burned. And this is important because we are still seeing stable old growth logging rates. So there was a bit of a spin about old growth logging being reduced, and it's certainly possible because of economic factors and some of the deferrals, but we are not seeing it yet in provincial data. And one reason is that it's not up to date. So the most recent data shows that we still have approximately 42,000 hectares of old growth logging per year. But this is for 21, 22, and it's incomplete. So we need more up-to-date, more detailed information to actually understand whether there is a change now. Overall, we still have about 200,000 hectares of clear cutting, old and second growth forest, and that's obviously a problem because we must allow some of the younger forests to grow back, to grow old again. And now on top of these trends, we have more wildfires, which means more losses, more cumulative impacts, making it even more difficult for species to hold on. And we certainly think that means that we need more action faster to sustain the web of life. And we have amazing progress regionally. We just heard from Saya about Clackwood Sound. That's amazing. And if you want to take another look at just how much got accomplished in Saya's territories, you can also go to our media releases and check out a map that Saya and I worked on in 23, showing just how much old growth remains standing in Clackwood, thanks to First Nations leadership, compared to the dramatic situation in other parts of Vancouver Island. Forest deferrals, very important, but not enough. There was really important mapping coming out of the old growth strategic review showing that 2.6 million hectares of the most at-risk old growth need immediate logging deferrals. We now have more than 2 million hectares of deferrals across BC, but less than half of the 2.6 most at risk have been deferred. And we have seen very little progress in the last year or two, and that's a big concern because this was meant as an interim solution, as a temporary measure to allow more time for nations and governments to figure out the long-term solutions. But we need more change on the ground leading to permanent progress. This is just an example of what you can find on the BC government website. This was shared in early 24, called From Review to Action, updating people in BC on the old growth strategic review. And it certainly shows ongoing work, but there's a lack of milestone dates. One thing that we really liked when we looked at the old growth strategic review, that it came with a 3-year plan with milestone dates leading to full implementation, and we're not seeing this in this update from last year, From Review to Action. So it's going to be really important for governments to put milestone dates on things so that we can actually see the change on the ground before it's too late. And very briefly, because it's so important, so often used by government, the promise of new forest landscape plans. Zoe Janka wrote this really cool article in the Tyee. The BC government highlights forest landscape plans as a new way to protect more forests, but we are not yet seeing this in practice. It seems more like an ongoing negotiation between different interests leading to maybe reduced logging, but not enough protection for the last at-risk old growth. So we again need to see connecting the dots between the different initiatives, making sure that goals like 30 by 30 will actually be implemented in regional planning, so that all parts of the province, all communities and nations will figure out how to make this a priority and make sure that we have the most at-risk ecosystems and habitats set aside in these plans. Here's another resource for people who want to read more. This is a brand new annual report from the 3 parties that have developed the nature agreement. This is also welcome and includes a lot of details about how much got protected in places like Clackwood or in the Caribou habitat region with Clean Cesar, a new provincial park, major progress. But this is regional progress, and we have a lot to work on to see progress leading to 30 by 30, which would essentially mean doubling protected areas across BC. One thing that's missing in this first progress report is to get a better sense of how much exactly did we accomplish in the last year? How many hectares were protected? how much did it cost, so that communities and First Nations get a better sense of how much funding is needed to protect a certain area, and governments can prepare to make sure that there's enough budget funding in the budget to enable ongoing progress leading to 30% protection. So again, the list of the most important commitments, and what's missing here is to see leadership from all parts of government, to make sure that these things move forward together, enable each other, that the funding from the nature agreement can be used for the most at-risk old growth forests, to make sure that everywhere we have forest landscape plans, we have some folks from the provincial government sharing the information to make sure that communities can really identify the most at-risk ecosystems and habitat and make those a priority. And very important, IPCAs. We have nations across BC that have developed their own proposals. They want to create new, modern, indigenous-led conservation solutions, but they need to be integrated into provincial laws to make sure that they're legally effective, so that they are powerful enough to support what nations envision, in some cases, an end to logging or other economic activity that could destroy these values. And again, the BEH framework leading to legislation, really important, and we will share the links to our online platforms, and that's only the first step that you can take. Sending a message online, share it with your friends and networks, consider requesting a meeting with your MLA, team up with your friends and neighbors, bring other people along, and also a big shout out to all the other groups that are working on this and other solutions, from Conservation North in the interior to Wildside, Wilderness Committee, Stand.Earth. You know, all these organizations offer sometimes joint opportunities and sometimes unique opportunities to join events, take action, learn more, and particularly about the First Nations in whose territories we live, and better understand how we can support them. I will pause here, and I'm sure we will have questions about all this.
Great. Thank you so much, Jens. Yeah, so just to reiterate that last point that Jens said, this is such a pivotal moment for old growth and biodiversity in BC. And one small thing that you can do after this webinar, perhaps, is use the online tool that we've created that Aurora put in the chat to write to your MLA. If you're wanting to do even more than that, as Jens said, we really, really encourage you to actually contact your MLA to set up a meeting to talk about protecting old growth. Awesome. So thank you so much to our panelists. We're going to move into the Q&A portion of this. So our first question is for Ross. And the question is, also this might be a big one, so take it as you will. What is your recommendation to allow forestry industry to continue? How can we support old growth while permitting forestry?
To continue at all?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really important to recognize that wood is an incredible resource and we will always have use for it as humans. It's just about how can we do it in a way that isn't purely like right now forests are managed for economic values only. So how can we do it in ways that also include ecological, biological, cultural, social, spiritual, all these other values that forests hold? How can we balance that? And that involves having different stakeholders involved, not shareholders who own stocks in the company, the stakeholders on the land, the people invested, the communities, the nations, the people who, you know, have invested stakes in the health of these forests. From a management perspective, there is so much we can do purely from doing things differently. You know, like I kind of mentioned at the end there, like every single study that looks into the efficacy and the ecological appropriateness of clear cutting shows that clear cutting in every single ecosystem, even the dry interior forest, is the wrong way to do it. Like, we're talking about removing the coarse woody debris here and leaving the fine materials, which they say, oh, it replicates fires, but fires burn the fine materials and leave the coarse woody debris. It's like it's completely backwards. But there are ways where we can manage these ecosystems that are more in line with the ecological processes, the disturbances that would naturally come about through selective logging, closed canopy harvesting, and working in ways to create more jobs and equity on the landscapes rather than coming in there and trying to bulldoze a forest and create something that's easily clear cut again and again and again by a dozer from a horror movie, you know, like a feller buncher that comes through and just clears things off easily. That only employs like 1 or 2 people. So if we get more people involved from, like, you know, biologists monitoring species, selective fallers, like really skilled fallers coming through and dropping trees specifically, and then you have people coming through with crews who are winching those trees together and taking them out on smaller roads, our impact would be far less on the land, and we would be able to actually have sustainable practices that support our communities and provide long-term jobs while still being able to utilize wood without destroying these ecosystems. If I could just plug one more thing, there's a really good place on Vancouver Island called Wildwood Eco Forest. I think their website is just like ecoforestry.org maybe. I can look that up and drop it into the chat, but they have a really great example of a old growth Douglas fir forest on the east side of Vancouver Island that has been selectively harvested and managed for over 70 years now, and it's still an old growth forest ecosystem that they've been selectively pulling logs out, creating sustainable jobs, supporting community, employing people locally. It's a great business. It's just small scale, and it's not you know, it's really hard to justify that from a business set perspective in this capitalist system because you can't generate massive amounts of profits that you can pay your shareholders. So it's like, how do we provide value to the stakeholders instead?
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ross. This next question is for Saya, and I know that you answered this in the chat, but I'm hoping you can speak to it even more. Could you please provide additional detail on park status and how provincial parks can infringe on Indigenous rights?
Well, Ploquet's experience with BC parks, and when we were getting close to voting on our first treaty in 1999, 1997, BC arbitrarily just dropped a bunch of provincial parks, 2 of them in our homeland, Clayoquot Plateau and Clayoquot Arm, without consultation. And it largely, it seemed to us that they were hoping that we would select land in our treaty around our village sites and thereby needing to, out of our own treaty dollars, have to compensate this BC parks from our treaty dollars to expand our eventually treaty. So it seemed nefarious to us. And then as carbon credits became an option, you know, these provincial parks, you know, if we make a new protected area now and prevent deforestation, we're allowed to participate in a carbon market and possibly obtain some value for trees standing. So that we actually can provide some economies or services to our community, so that those options are not available in a provincial park or in a provincial park designation that was done without our consultation. So provincial parks also can prevent us from accessing monumental cedars, which is one of the reasons why we are designating some conservancies, is to literally protect them for our cultural use. A provincial park can prevent that. Going in to go and take a longhouse log can be prevented in a provincial park. Hunting grounds, you know, can be difficult. You can be harassed by provincial park rangers and such. So those are some of the subtleties to a provincial park.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh, yeah, keep going.
Yeah. I also wanted to add to Ross's last comment too about what forestry looks like, because we brushed up. We were owners of a forest company, and we argued against retention levels for so long on how to get a forest industry that is somewhat sustainable, and it was nearly impossible. We argued about retention levels, or they're laying out cut blocks between each fingers of a tributary, and our survey team would say, well, why don't we approve these two, but tell them to come back in 5 years to take that cut block between the other creeks. And they're saying, oh, well, the economics are that we need to take all 3 of those cut blocks. And they're just small parking lots. It's still clear cut on a smaller scale. And we had to learn on our own that to not impact biodiversity, at least in theory, the retention levels have to be 75%. And you have to take a spectrum of the whole watershed. If the watershed is 10% balsam and spruce, and when you make your road to go into the forest, you need to take a spectrum of the same watershed amount, and you should only take 75%. 25% of the block, and that's nearly impossible in today's economics, unless it's a small scale hauling out as the wildwood forest that Ross had mentioned. But yeah, thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. That's a really, I think, important piece of experience that you've had. And thank you for sharing about the provincial parks. I think it can be missed sometimes from the ENGO perspective, just our history of supporting provincial parks. So it's really important to remind ourselves about that. This question is for Jens. So forestry frequently talks about jobs and economic benefits to communities. Are there conversations happening that fully calculate the economics of forestry, including healthcare changes, water protection, and remediation costs, and tourism, etc.?
Well, we have quite a bit of information about just how significant the benefits of old growth and intact forests are for our society. And we also have quite a bit of research done on some of the blind spots and shortcomings in how we do forestry. Just thinking about the Focus magazine with an article that you can easily find with the words, "Forestry doesn't pay the bills," showing that we pay massive amounts in terms of taxpayer dollars to subsidize industrial forestry with things like road building, or the provincial staff paid to enable and support business as usual logging, and a total lack of accounting of the externalized costs in form of erosion, lack of flood protection, all the services that we are losing. We will soon share more information looking at a new study about economic benefits of standing old growth forest, but there's already one example for the Port Renfrew area that a consultant firm called ESSA did in 21 that showed, just by looking at tourism, recreation, carbon, non-timber forest products, that protecting old growth has more economic benefits for society compared to business as usual logging. One thing that I will add is that we absolutely need people with a background in forestry to help us to be better prepared for the future. We are now looking at vast swath of land covered by young, dense second growth forests, and we have a lot of work to do to bring some ecological integrity back into these forests. Ross could talk a lot more about this, but this is obviously an area where we could, by redirecting subsidies and paying for some of the benefits that we depend on, we can create a big number of jobs that have been lost in industry. And we still have an opportunity for value-added wood products and selective logging, First Nations, community forest projects. There will be less timber because we have logged too much, but there's an opportunity to do forestry differently in a way that would create more jobs per tree, ending raw log exports. We've known this for a long time. It's just very frustrating that we are not moving faster to making these changes. Without a doubt, the pressure is growing because we are paying a bigger price for inaction every day, and it's coming to us in form of climate disasters, the cost of climate disasters that could be reduced if we would keep more trees standing, and the overall impacts on our economy, acknowledging that tourism, recreation, and many other parts of a diverse economy directly depend on beautiful, awesome old growth forests and other ecosystems that people want to cherish.
Great, thank you. So this question wasn't specified to anyone, so if whoever feels called to answer it. The list of species that are impacted by forestry has not been updated since 2006. This is causing the continual decline of many old growth dependent species. In addition, wildlife surveys are not mandated ahead of granting a forestry license. How can we find a way to protect these species under these circumstances? Anyone feel called?
Well, I will briefly connect the dots to the importance of enacting biodiversity and ecosystem health legislation. It's only one of the opportunities or the things that need to happen, but it could be the most sweeping one. The wording in the old growth strategic review was about making biodiversity a priority for all sectors. So that's framing leading to a true paradigm shift where we would truly respect nature's limits, where we would use science-based ecosystem targets, use all the mapping and information we already have about critical habitats of species like spotted owl and caribou. And it would have to be tied to interim measures as a temporary solution before agreeing to long-term conservation solutions. But this would take the pressure off looking at many ecosystems and species if we do it right. There are also a lot of other opportunities looking at wildlife regulations and so on, but we need one legislation that would really address a lot of ecosystems and species in one step.
Awesome. Thanks, Jens. So there's a question in the chat that I'm going to slightly adapt. So the original question is asking about how and why Indigenous nations must integrate into Western law to become legally legitimate. And I'm wondering, Saya, if you want to speak to how Tla'aque'ehuat law has been incorporated into the IPCA, and if that has come up against sort of Canadian colonial legal structures, and if so, how you've sort of pushed back against that.
Yeah, well, you know, the conservancies that were designated by British Columbia, yeah, like I said, was an attempt to recognize Tla'aque'ehuat law, but I was clear to say that it falls short of many things, but the lesser of two evils isn't the right wording either. Because it does a lot. It protects our culture, things that would be in our laws. It's there for us to access monumental cedars. The purpose is to provide a vibrant and livelihood of an ecosystem with hunting and waterfowl and clam gardens that are on the foreshores. So it does meet a lot of our interests. But, you know, as you know, even when we look at economies, it's not providing our fiscal benefit. It's you know, we're still not obtaining carbon credits, or we're you know, the economy of Tofino is a $400 million economy. That's great. That's you'd be hard pressed to make 400 million a year by logging, just in Clayoquot Sound. So These conservancies aren't being linked to tourism. We aren't deriving a benefit from designating these, which as humans, we all have, things for our community to deliver social welfare programs, training, education, infrastructure. We have a gravel road here. We have no roof over our basketball court. Like there's just so much. And so a designation that would include our Aboriginal right to benefit from our homeland, 10,000 years of potlatching laws to benefit from our homeland and to feed our people. That isn't incorporated into these designations. A tribal park designation would say you're on the foreshores of this wonderful island that is cleaning and bringing salmon and great oyster leases. Well, those oyster leases should be contributing to the nation, not just to British Columbia or to Ottawa.
Totally. Thank you so much. Okay, so this one again is for whomever of you feel called to answer. Old growth exists in cities and municipalities too, and its protection isn't guaranteed. Has any analysis been done on urban tree bylaws to see who is and isn't protecting forests in their communities, and how to strengthen urban tree protection?
Well, I will jump in because we have this wonderful new resource, Sierra Club BC resource, Move the Dial, with a lot of tools and recommendations for local governments that you can find on our website. Those of you who receive Sierra Club BC emails probably got an email from David Quick highlighting this new resource and all the different ways we can take action. And I'm sure it's already in the chat box. So really good question, and so important, because we really need old trees, young trees, all kinds of trees, and other natural infrastructure in communities and urban spaces in light of climate change. But I will keep my contribution short because we have this resource, and invite my fellow panelists to add.
I actually just early. Someone could repeat it? Am I still disconnected?
No, we can hear you now. I think you were frozen for a second. We were talking about old growth and oh, now he's gone.
Hi, sorry. Something's happening with my computer.
Okay.
What was the question?
Yeah, so there's a question about old growth in urban areas and thinking about sort of urban tree protection. And Jens was talking about a program that Sierra Club has called Move the Dial, which is about pushing local municipal governments. But do you want to speak at all to urban tree canopy, old growth in urban areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important and often overlooked thing. Like so often from like an NGO space, we're trying to protect these swaths of kind of like land wilderness out there. But I mean, if you know of some old growth trees near you, I think that's a really great, amazing opportunity to galvanize community around. So if there's like any sort of threat to it, like, you become kind of like your neighborhood watch group and be the friends of your own little neighborhood old growth. And yeah, I mean, I just think that's like such an amazing kind of like gateway for people to get involved with environmental stuff. Just like it's literally right in your backyard. And if you have access to it, like it creates such an amazing thing for everybody in the community. So rally around it. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, and another question, Ross, I mean, we've talked a lot about, how amazing old growth is and sort of some of the pathways that we can be taking to care for these ecosystems, these communities a lot better. Something we've talked about a little bit less is old growth's relationship with climate change. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how they work to mitigate climate risks like wildfire, droughts, and landslides.
Yeah, I mean, this is so complex. I could talk for ages about this, but I mean, the the best way to think about it is the more complexity you have, the better it is for climate change. The more diversity you have, like within that complexity, you have ecological and biological diversity. So you have diversity, let's say at the genetic level within populations of different species. From an evolutionary standpoint, the more um, things that are going to impact them, the more diversity they have in that population, the more resilient they are to adapt to those changes and be able to survive. So the more diversity in our populations of red cedars to hemlocks to martens to fish to bears, the more diversity we have genetically within those populations, the more adaptable they are to changes that may come their way as a result of climate change or other anthropogenic factors. Um, at that same level, it's like this, or to the same point, if you have diversity within the ecosystem, of again, like all those different trees, for example, the bigger, older ones with more spacing in between them, all the little ones in the understory, that is going to create a lot of diversity that adds to the complexity of that ecosystem that makes it more resilient to both wildfires, drought, heavy rain events like what are they called? Atmospheric rivers that we're getting more frequently there, because that complexity. So when a fire comes through, naturally, it's only going to burn the tinier bits on the forest floor because those bigger, older trees are going to be more resilient to that fire because they have thicker bark. There's also going to be more moisture present because of all that complexity there. So it's not going to let that fire travel as fast versus having a second growth forest where that complexity and diversity has been reduced and you have a similar age stand of trees that are all super close together, monolayer canopy or single layer canopy, bunch of ladder fuels. When fire comes through, it's going to burn that whole forest and spread to the canopy to become a crown fire, and it's going to burn that a lot hotter and faster and then leave a desertified area after the fact, versus fire being a kind of healthy beneficial thing in a healthy forest ecosystem because that ecosystem has the diversity to mitigate that impact. And then from a drought thing, it's the same thing. The more complexity you have with all those different roots and photosynthesizing things in the understory, the mid layer, and the canopy, the more moisture it's going to be able to hold. So when you have drought, it's going to keep things shaded and cooler for longer. More moisture is going to be present. More moisture is going to slowly leach out and make its way into our rivers, which means our rivers are going to run for longer in the summertime instead of drying up right away. And then when you have freak rain events like the atmospheric rivers we have, again, all that complexity, all the mosses and the tiny little things, it all soaks up and stores all that water, acting like a giant sponge, which again regulates its flow down out through the watershed. It, controls the flow, and the surrounding floodplains kind of make sure that it moves through slowly and not so rapidly that it just erodes and takes a lot of sediment and things with it. So again, it's just kind of like having this complexity within this ecosystem is going to provide the opportunity for this ecosystem to adapt and mitigate the changes that are inevitably coming our way. And it kind of speaks to the fact that like we need to maintain this diversity not only everywhere where it already exists, i.e. old growth forests, but we need to do everything we can to restore the second growth forests that are all kind of simplified, complex or uncomplex, complexless, complexness, um, ecosystems and restore that ecology and biodiversity so that we can create more resilience within those second growth forests that will be impacted by the same factors, but are just set up in a place that are far less resilient now.
Well, thank you. That was super helpful and really comprehensive. I'm super impressed by that answer. We have an interesting question. So we've talked a little bit about, what you can do, talking to your MLAs, sort of advocating for shifting governmental policy. But we have a question here that, Sai, I think you would be most appropriate to answer. You've already touched on this a little bit with your experience working with forestry companies, but I see a lot of initiatives for communicating with governments. Are there any aimed to logging companies, and what has been the reaction and outcome?
Well, Cloakwood's experience is unique because 84 court case, but then in the 90s, the war in the woods, and led to the British Columbia awarding the tree farm license to be owned by the 5 nations in the region. So nevertheless, when we went to make protected areas, we still had to convince shareholders of a forest company to surrender the tree farm to British Columbia to allow us, and we still had to convince them to accept this fair market value. We had to negotiate valuation, and so even though we were owners of the company, there were other nations that didn't own any forest land that were on the shareholders, and we had to treat them like you would almost any other forest company, treat them like a business, compensate them fair market value. And so there was a lot of awareness that was needed to penetrate into the board of directors, to articulate, and it wasn't lost upon them that forestry was already difficult in Clayoquot Sound, and that the company was not meeting its AAC because we were always reducing cut blocks and increasing retention levels, and it was always a difficult company to manage. But we still had to penetrate the board of directors and convince them to surrender and sell the tree farm to allow us to advance.
Awesome, thank you. That's super interesting, and just thinking about sort of different tactics and pathways that we need to be using. I think that's a really useful and inspiring story, and yeah, thank you to all of the work that you've done to make that happen. Awesome. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. I think this has been a awesome discussion. I know I learned a lot tonight, and I hope that all of you here feel the same way. Yeah, thank you for all attending. It's been great to have all of the questions and the chat really active. We love to see this participation. We will be sending out the recording to everyone who registered, so please feel free to share it. If something touched you, pass it along. And hopefully together we can speak up for the beings and the web of life that sustain us all. So finally, Sierra Club BC, of course, is a nonprofit, so we rely on donations. Any amount totally helps us do our important work. The donation link is going to be in the chat if you feel called. We so welcome your support. Of course, there's no pressure, but if you have a bit of extra cash, we would love it. And you can find more about all of our panelists online. So Nerdy About Nature will drop and Sai will drop the YouTube link. Again, here is the link to the forest letter from 14 NGOs to federal parties. Yes, and then we're just, a lot of other links in the chat, which we hope that you will look through. I know that people were already talking about sending these letters, and so we hope to continue to have your support through meeting with MLAs, through donating, through having conversations with your loved ones. Every conversation about climate, about old growth, about the state of forests in BC is useful action that you can take. So thank you so much to our panelists again, and I hope that you will have a wonderful night.